The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Education, leading the world of digital and video learning. Discovery Education, connect to a world of learning.
Get ready to travel into America's past as Assignment Discovery takes you from the Great War to the Great Depression.
First, discover the conditions that led to World War I.
Then explore America's involvement in the Great War in the United States and World War I.
Next, discover how the aftermath of war led to a renewed sense of freedom in the Roaring '20s.
Then explore how shifting attitudes transformed American music in The Birth of Jazz.
Finally, discover how temperance laws gave way to criminals in Prohibition and the American Gangster.
It's social upheaval, speakeasies, and song coming up next.
As you watch the first half of this program, keep these questions in mind.
What conditions led to American involvement in World War I?
How did World War I affect American culture in the 1920s?
As industrial development allowed cities in Europe to grow, economic rivalries began to develop. An arms race developed that would eventually increase international tensions and lead to war.
What do people at your school compete over?
Competing for grades, it's like there's a lot of stress to perform well and perform to the same standard or above the standard of your classmates.
People compete in my school for grades and for getting, being faster on the track team, throwing farther, stuff like that.
Competition is kind of makes me feel good about myself if I do good, or if I do bad, it makes you try harder.
The fun of having the challenge of having something to strive for.
When we play against a rival, it's like no other game. I mean, you go out and you leave everything out on the field.
I just love the heat of being under pressure. I love having to win.
Definitely the goal, just knowing that you could succeed and do well, and just to prove it to yourself that you could do things.
In 1914, Europe had been at peace for 40 years. Industrial development had allowed Berlin and other cities to enjoy massive growth. But economic rivalries, imperial competition, and rising nationalism were spreading across the continent, and militarism, the glorification of the military, was growing. The great powers expanded their armies and navies. The result was an arms race that only aggravated the mistrust countries felt toward one another. Distrust of each other led the great powers to sign treaties pledging to defend one another if they were ever attacked. These alliances were intended to create powerful combinations that no one would dare attack. Gradually, two huge alliances emerged: the Triple Alliance of Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, and the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain. The growth of these rival alliances increased international tensions even more. How did World War I start? These tensions erupted with the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria during his visit to Serbia on June 28, 1914. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Because the alliances were in place, a chain reaction occurred, and the major powers began declaring war on one another. Germany invaded France through neutral Belgium. Because of this action, Britain joined forces with the French against Germany. The Western Front was born. Why was it called the Great War? Newspapers soon began calling it the Great War because it was the largest conflict the world had ever seen. The French mobilized 8.5 million men, the British 9 million, the Russians 12 million, and the Germans 11 million. It lasted for 4 horrible years. When the war started, people were full of enthusiasm and patriotism. Young men rushed to enlist, and crowds cheered them. But their enthusiasm was short-lived. This was a new kind of war, far deadlier than any fought before. On the Western Front, the warring armies made a vast system of trenches stretching from Switzerland to the English Channel. Between the enemy lines was no man's land, an empty stretch of ground filled with bomb craters and barbed wire where no soldier could survive. How did technology change the war? Military tactics had not changed for 100 years, but weapons had made the leap into the 20th century. There were new inventions like machine guns that could fire hundreds of bullets in a minute. Now a single defender could wipe out a whole troop of oncoming soldiers. Artillery could bomb enemy encampments from miles away. The new factories back home could pump out new weapons at an unheard of rate. And now science, previously seen as a sign of progress, was used for killing. Chemical warfare was also put into use. Poison gas, capable of blinding or even killing, was now part of a soldier's arsenal. What was life like in the trenches? Soldiers in trenches lived a primitive life. They fought, ate, and slept in the trenches. There was no proper sanitation. Fear, hunger, thirst, and cold were constants, and death was all around. The huge losses of life and the prolonged nature of the war had a profound effect on the soldiers and the people back home. No one had predicted how devastating the war would be, or how it would change the way the world looked at war.
Did you know? While historians debate the exact number of casualties lost during the war, they estimate that more than 8 million soldiers died in World War I.
America was prospering in 1916 as war raged in Europe. But as Western defenses faltered under German advances, Americans pressed President Woodrow Wilson to make a pact that would change the course of history.
Have you ever made a pact with someone?
Of course I've made a pact with someone, like my best friends, you know. Secrets, it's a big thing between girls. I've made pacts with a couple of friends not to tell the people they have crushes on.
I made a pact with my friend that we were going to succeed in school and go to an Ivy League college.
You have to sign the honor code for the school, and if you go back on your agreement with them, then they can kick you out.
I have made a pact with my brother when we went to college that we wouldn't grow apart because I wouldn't be seeing him a lot.
If I get all A's, I get a dirt bike.
We sort of have an unspoken pact with my parents that if we get good grades, we get to choose a restaurant that we want to go out to.
I have a pact with my parents. Basically, if I don't do well in school, I get in trouble.
Europe during the early 1900s was a land of tension. Nationalism, imperial rivalries, the buildup of huge armies and navies, and a complicated web of alliances helped make Europe a powder keg waiting for a match. That match was lit when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Serbia in 1914.
From a pistol shot at Sarajevo, the first of the great modern world wars exploded. And almost overnight, all of Europe was engulfed in conflict. Once the great armies had met head-on, the conflict resolved itself into a desperate struggle to hold this plot of ground, this foot of earth. Military analysts called it positional warfare. But the foot soldiers knew it only as a war of trenches, a desperate fight for a waterlogged hold.
The war pitted the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire against the Allied powers of Russia, France, and Britain. The United States tried to stay out of the war. President Woodrow Wilson issued a proclamation of strict and impartial neutrality. Although the United States would not fight the war, the American people began to take sides. The common language and culture shared with Britain, combined with increasing stories of Germany's brutal actions in Belgium, made most Americans favor the Allies. American industries sent supplies to the countries at war across the Atlantic. Although some U.S. companies supplied the Central Powers, most sold their ammunition, equipment, and other war supplies to the Allies. Soon, the Germans began attacking shipments from America using a lethal underwater weapon, submarines, or U-boats. In 1915, a U-boat sank the British passenger ship Lusitania, which was also transporting ammunition from New York to Britain. 124 Americans on board lost their lives.
The Lusitania, America's ship of fate. As passengers line the rail, they are getting their last look at land and at life. No hint of the panic that is to come 6 days later here. No suggestion of trepidation, no feeling of disaster. But then, off the coast of Ireland, the first German torpedo struck. Germany's flagrant violation of international law burst below decks. The warning had its tragic aftermath. Germany was inviting us to war.
Americans were outraged by the attack. Fearing American entry into the war, Germany halted the U-boat attacks. But 2 years later, desperate to win a victory, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. On February 24, 1917, the British intercepted a telegram from Arthur Zimmermann, Germany's foreign minister, to the government of Mexico. In it, Zimmermann promised American lands to Mexico if it attacked the United States. The British gave a copy of the message to American officials. When it was published, American anger over Zimmermann's telegram and the resumed attacks on U.S. merchant ships exploded into war fever. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson sent Congress a declaration of war, which the House and Senate quickly approved. After nearly 3 years of neutrality, American troops set off to join the war. Did you know? American involvement in World War I helped change the course of the war. America's enormous supply of weapons, strong navy, and military conscription guaranteeing manpower were decisive factors in the Allied victory.
In the aftermath of World War I, many Americans reevaluated their pre-war conventions. Their attitudes towards race, religion, and gender began to change, giving way to an era that would come to be known as the Roaring Twenties.
What do you know about the Roaring Twenties?
The 20s were known as the Roaring Twenties.
The Ford Motor Company really came to the forefront in the 1920s.
There was a lot of bootlegging of alcohol and underground places where you could get alcohol, and they would smuggle it across rivers and whatnot.
The flapper girls in the 1920s, they were kind of They symbolized more freedom, more women's rights.
And child labor was banned, and women's rights were coming to the forefront, and the world was changing at a really quick pace.
The 1920s were a time of enormous social and cultural change in America. War-weary Americans elected Warren G. Harding as president in 1920. Harding promised a return to normalcy after World War I. He wanted to isolate the United States from the rest of the world and focus on issues at home. Harding's term as president ushered in an era of prosperity, rapid industrialization, social experimentation, and artistic growth that became known as the Roaring Twenties. At the close of World War I, the United States had slipped into an economic slump. President Harding and his successor, Calvin Coolidge, believed that the country's future lay in big business, and they worked to support industrial growth. As a result, unemployment dropped, production increased, and wages rose. Americans earned more money. They invested more of it in the stock market, and the market soared. Many people borrowed money to invest in the booming market. During the Roaring Twenties, Americans enjoyed the highest quality of life in the world. Basic utilities such as natural gas, hot and cold running water, and electricity became widely available. Americans could buy new refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and other electrical appliances. Affordable mass-produced automobiles made people more mobile. Moving pictures were transformed by the introduction of sound. And radios brought news and entertainment directly into people's homes for the first time and ushered in the information age. The 20s saw the spread of the uniquely American music called jazz. Originally created by African American musicians in New Orleans, jazz became popular across the country. Thanks to the 19th Amendment, women voted in a national election for the first time in 1920. But women made other advances in the 1920s as well. The Women's Trade Union League worked to improve working conditions for women. And more women than ever graduated from high school, attended college, and got jobs. Young women in particular benefited from these changes. Some women, known as flappers, adopted a new style of dress and behavior that challenged many accepted social norms. But the 20s were also a time of religious, racial, ethnic, and political conflict. After years of lobbying by members of the temperance movement, the nation approved the 18th Amendment in 1919. This new law made the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol illegal. It ushered in a period called Prohibition. Almost immediately, thousands of illegal bars sprang up. Called speakeasies, these hidden bars became popular places to gather. Bootlegging, the illegal importing of alcohol, also became widespread. The largest groups of bootleggers were organized crime gangs. These gangs were often led by powerful figures such as Al Capone, who used violence and intimidation to create sprawling gangland empires. Although it remained a law throughout the 20s, Prohibition became increasingly difficult to enforce, and the rise in crime it produced became a serious problem. Fear of foreigners was common during this decade. Many Americans became anxious when communists took control of Russia because they feared the same thing could happen at home. This fear became known as the Red Scare, and it led to the rounding up and mistreatment of thousands of people suspected of being communists, socialists, and anarchists. Fear and intolerance also led to the growth of the Ku Klux Klan. This group rejected the notion of racial equality. At its height in 1924, the Klan had more than 4 million members, including politicians and members of law enforcement. New immigrants and members of minority groups were often persecuted during the 20s. Economic problems also loomed. The country's wealth was largely controlled by a small portion of the population. Top businessmen reaped huge benefits. But many workers and farmers struggled to make a living and often went into debt. This growing divide between the rich and the poor, along with a decrease in industrial production and overspeculation in the stock market, set the stage for a looming economic crisis that would bring the Roaring Twenties to a screeching halt. You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
What conditions led to American involvement in World War I?
How did World War I affect American culture in the 1920s?
If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.
As you watch the second half of this program, keep these questions in mind.
Where does jazz have its roots?
What social conditions led to the rise of organized crime in America?
During the 1920s, African American artists were creating literature, music, and artwork that reflected their history and experiences.
How does music reflect its society?
I think music in a culture reflects everyone living in it at the time period, especially as everyone grows and changes.
It reflects the values of the culture and what's going on in certain neighborhoods.
Back in the 70s with hippies and everything, like rock and roll, it really reflected freedom and just everything against the Vietnam War.
The jazz age of the 1920s was symbolic of how the people felt. Jazz is very loose and very kind of swingy.
In addition to the economic, industrial, and social changes that were taking place in America during the 1920s, an artistic and cultural renaissance occurred. This cultural movement led many to nickname the decade the Jazz Age. This renaissance got its start in African American communities. Perhaps one of the greatest contributions made to American culture during the 20s came in the form of music. African American musicians first developed jazz in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Jazz musicians combined the sounds of the Caribbean, West Africa, and the cotton fields of the rural South into a uniquely American musical form. Ideal for dancing, the new sound quickly gained popularity in speakeasies and nightclubs from New York to Chicago. Cornet player and bandleader Louis Armstrong, composer Duke Ellington, and singer Bessie Smith were just some of the many people who helped create and refine jazz. Clarinetist Benny Goodman and other white musicians also performed jazz, which helped popularize it. And as radios became cheaper and more common in American homes, jazz spread even further. The popular composer George Gershwin debuted Rhapsody in Blue in New York in 1924. That composition was heavily influenced by jazz. Jazz was particularly popular with young people who flocked to nightclubs and speakeasies to dance the Charleston. The Charleston also had its origins in African American culture, but whites as well as blacks were drawn to the dance's energetic movements and the upbeat tempos and infectious rhythms of jazz. Jazz also influenced the fashions worn in the 20s. The Charleston's fast movements made the loose, high-cut dresses worn by flappers mandatory. Young women cut their hair short, and men wore baggy pants known as Oxford bags. Jazz culture also made its way into the literature of the day. Author F. Scott Fitzgerald reflected the carefree youth culture and post-war ideals of the jazz generation, a generation committed to having a good time while breaking down the accepted social standards of behavior. While the sexes may have become more equal during the Jazz Age, barriers between the races remained. Many jazz clubs, including the famous Cotton Club in New York City's Harlem neighborhood, let in white customers only. Although it would take decades before African Americans would gain the same rights as whites, the popularity of jazz helped elevate their status in society. But jazz was just one part of a cultural movement taking place in New York during the 1920s. Called the Harlem Renaissance, this movement included literature and politics too. Writer Langston Hughes helped introduce African American culture and concerns to the world. His jazz-inspired poetry was praised for the beauty of his words and for its moving expressions of racial pride. Political leader Marcus Garvey epitomized this racial pride. Born in Jamaica, Garvey was the leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Designed to promote the spirit of race pride, the UNIA worked to foster worldwide unity among all blacks. Garvey urged blacks to create an independent economy. He encouraged founding a new nation in Africa that would provide African Americans the liberties they were denied at home. Although many Americans resisted the social changes taking place during the 1920s, the Jazz Age marked the first time that African American music and culture made their way into popular culture. And for the first time in America, the culture of a minority was embraced by the majority. Did you know? The Harlem Renaissance thrived during the 1920s and 30s until the Great Depression forced many artists to abandon New York in search of jobs.
Prohibition made selling alcohol illegal in 1919. But while some people reveled in their legal and moral victory, others saw an opportunity for a lucrative career.
What conditions can lead to crime?
I think one of the conditions that definitely leads to crime is childhood.
Violent video games.
If there's a high poverty rate or a high jobless rate.
In the 1920s, some conditions that led to crime were the strict laws, like prohibition.
A lot of crime also came from laissez-faire, which meant like free trade and the government wouldn't get involved. And so without those government regulations, there are a lot of spots for problems.
I think it's a thirst for power.
It was a scene guaranteed to bring dismay to many in America. People dancing the night away to all sorts of modern music. For more than 2 decades, the temperance movement campaigned against drunkenness and associated behavior. But in January 1920, supporters of temperance got their way. The sale and distribution of alcohol was banned. They called it prohibition and considered it a noble experiment.
I can't believe that anybody, any right-thinking person today, could ever suggest that prohibition was a noble experiment. Prohibition was one of the worst things that ever happened to this country.
Prohibition gave rise to the bootleg years, and bootlegging led to organized crime. Gangsters and their accomplices were suddenly everywhere, on the streets, in City Hall, in cheap establishments, and in high-class parties.
Prohibition, let's face it, prohibition is what created the mob.
Gangsters inspired movies, filled newspapers, and bankrolled the new kind of music called jazz. The aim of prohibition had been to dim the bright lights of Broadway and bring people back to the traditional values of hard work and sobriety. But it backfired. In the period of economic boom that followed World War I, people didn't want sobriety. They wanted fun. Prohibition divided the nation, and half of America went underground. This was once the best-kept secret in Manhattan. In a midtown basement, beneath the bustle of New York's 52nd Street, there lies a hidden treasure from the Roaring '20s. A massive door cut from the brickwork of a neighboring wall and weighing a hefty 4,000 pounds protects a wine cellar. This wine cellar now plays host to upscale soirees and high-powered business lunches. But it started very differently, as part of a speakeasy, the 21 Club. The speakeasy as an American institution was a product of Prohibition, and the 21 Club was the pick of the crop. Speakeasies, or hidden saloons and nightclubs, sold liquor illegally. And thanks to Prohibition, respectable people found themselves on the wrong side of the law. It opened in 1920, and while gangsters never ran the club, its suppliers must have had shady connections.
During Prohibition, the 21 Club was raided several times by federal agents.
So the club's owners deployed a wide range of covert devices to keep the agents at bay.
When they did appear at the front door, a series of bells were pressed and buzzers were sounded, and the shelves, the back shelves, which held bottles of spirits and wines and glassware, flipped upside down. The bottles and glassware went crashing down into the New York City sewer system and a sand pit.
The collapsible shelves have long gone, but the most unusual feature of the club is still in working order: the 4,000-pound secret cellar door.
It was really difficult for federal agents to come in and find the door that is behind me at present. The federal agents did come in and try and find that using matches and other devices, but were never able to find it.
And this is why the police were stumped. The door could be opened only using a special key in a special way.
You would insert this 18-inch skewer in there, trigger the mechanism on the back of the door, and then push open the 4,000-pound door. And in we go.
The 21 Club was a custom-built speakeasy designed for breaking the law. But as a speakeasy, it was far from unique. Across America during the 1920s, no fewer than 200,000 speakeasies opened for business. This is one of New York's oldest bars, Pete's Tavern. But during Prohibition, it too became a speakeasy. And its clientele entered through a fake refrigerator in the back of an adjacent florist. Customers liked the excitement and glamour of visiting a speakeasy, including the possibility of meeting one of the illegal liquor suppliers. By the mid-1920s, bootlegging was a multi-million-dollar business, employing thousands of people. As legitimate beer companies closed down, gangsters bought them up and became brewers. In spite of the efforts of the U.S. Coast Guard, gangsters also became smugglers. Flotillas of rum-running ships brought liquor in from Europe. Gangsters organized a massive cross-border traffic in liquor from Canada, often going to ingenious lengths to hide it in cars. And fleets of gangster-owned trucks brought beer and whiskey to the city. Prohibition had become the mother of the mob, and gangsters became experts in liquor. But a lot of the liquor was of dubious quality. Bootleggers soon learned the tricks and how to spot it. Sometimes bootleggers would water down liquor for a higher profit. Before long, buyers and sellers began a ritual of exchange. Growing up side by side with the bootlegging industry was a young Hollywood. It didn't take long for movie makers to get interested in illicit liquor.
Howdy now, beer. Where'd you get the slops?
Well, it's good, ain't it? And it's cheaper than yours.
How much you paying for this stuff?
2 bits of glass.
All right, screw. I thought so. You can sell ours for the same price.
In the 1931 classic movie, The Public Enemy, James Cagney gives gangsters a lesson in how to win bootlegging business from the competition. For the speakeasy barman, it was an occupational hazard.
Somebody's got to protect your customers.
But what am I going to do? I can't help it if I have to buy from Schemer Burns. They tell me the same thing that you do.
You're yellow.
Oh, please, you ain't gonna slug me, are you?
Maybe not today. But I'm telling you this for the last time. When Dutch comes around, he's gonna leave you some beer. And you're gonna take it. And you're gonna kick him with the dough. If you don't, somebody's gonna drop by here and kick your teeth out one at a time.
All right, so get the money.
Prohibition was a pressure cooker. In such an overheated world, menace and muscle were commonplace. Where there was money and liquor, trouble often followed. The fledgling gangsters of the big cities were quick to spot an opportunity, and if that meant going to war with rivals for control of lucrative liquor franchises, then so be it. Nowhere was this truer than in Chicago. It was here the frontline battles of the bootleg wars would be fought, and the names of a generation of gangsters would achieve immortality. At the Chicago Tribune building, veteran crime reporter John O'Brien describes the geography of Chicago gangland.
You had on the south side probably more gangs than elsewhere, but that doesn't mean that they held the ace cards. The Dion O'Banion gang on the north side and the George Bugs Moran gang also on the north side were powerful entities. On the south side, not too far south from downtown Chicago, Capone held his organization in sway with Johnny Torrio, who would position him in that role. But further south and further southwest, you had the O'Donnell brothers, the four O'Donnell brothers, led by Spike O'Donnell. There were saloons, brothels, and these gang leaders competed for a geographic stake in all these activities.
As the gangs prepared for war, gangsters became celebrities, and the movie industry would faithfully record it all. By the late 1920s, 12 million Americans were going to movie theaters every day, and gangster pictures were among the highest box office earners. Hollywood portrayed so much of the gangster action truthfully because in swanky parties and seedy speakeasies alike, movie makers and mobsters rubbed shoulders. The line between the real gangland and its Hollywood counterpart became increasingly blurred. And for one actor in particular, that line got very blurred indeed. Buried in a quiet corner of a Hollywood cemetery lies an actor who came to symbolize the close relationship between movie makers and mobsters. During the 1930s, he became a movie star, but he started out as a bootlegger in New York. His name was George Raft. Raft's nephew, Tony, recalls some of the mourners at the actor's funeral.
I noticed also a line of cars with people that were dressed with white shoes and suspenders and so forth, which I kind of hesitated even looking at them.
Raft had grown up poor. He first trained as a boxer and then a dancer. However, his personal experiences with gangsters would shape his acting career. Some claim that Raft learned the gangster look from the mobster Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. That look was to make Raft a star, but at first it was nearly his downfall.
Well, there was a time where he was gotten friendly with a lot of the mobster people and bosses, and especially in particular with their girlfriends, which wasn't very much appreciated. And you know, George Raft was a ladies' man.
And Hollywood is where he ended up, which was a tough place for aspiring actors. After a string of small parts in low-budget movies, Raft's big break finally came with the movie Scarface. Raft's role as the boss's sidekick, Ronaldo, wowed audiences across America. In this scene, Raft established his trademark, giving the gangster look while casually tossing a lucky coin. Raft's presence brought greater realism to gangster movies, But according to nephew Tony, it also brought a close encounter in Chicago with the gangster Al Capone.
The discussion was that Al Capone would look at him and say, you know, I like what you're doing in Hollywood. It's really great. But why are you giving all of my secrets away? He said, well, these people in Hollywood, they don't know what it is like for someone to die or what it feels like or what it looks like when someone got shot. And I'm the only one that can tell them how to do it. Well, he says, all right, okay, you go ahead and do your filming in Hollywood. And while you're here in Chicago, I'm going to send you a couple of guys along with you as a guard because I don't want anything to happen to you. Because here in Chicago, they blame me for everything, including the rain.
Today, George Raft lies largely forgotten. But his look and style influenced many actors and gangsters.
Go to it, boys. Put down the bag there. Go to it there.
As the years wore on, Prohibition grew increasingly more unpopular. Newsreels like these were created to promote the good deeds of the Prohibition Bureau, but what they showed was something very different. Onlookers openly salvaged leftover liquor right under the agents' noses. Respect for the law and law enforcement fell to an all-time low. To make matters worse, many police officers and public officials were corrupt. Everyone, it seems, was on the take, and the most visible offenders were in Chicago.
Chicago at that time, certainly by reputation, by all we know, Chicago was a very corrupt city. But by the way, not the most corrupt necessarily in the United States by any means, but it was a corrupt city. Thanks to Prohibition, a mob was in there to help them corrupt. They had the money to corrupt.
And this man was the most corrupt public servant of all, Chicago's high-flying mayor, Big Bill Thompson. Despite the claims on his election poster, Big Bill was indeed bought, bossed, and bluffed by gangsters who kept him in office and in liquor.
He pandered to the worst in people to get himself voted into office. Big Bill Thompson was an out-and-out crook, a very wealthy crook, I might add, when he started, but a crook.
More grateful that the principles for which I have fought have been sustained than any personal honor to myself.
If it was acceptable for the mayor to be corrupt, then it was acceptable for everyone else on the city's payroll. Judges, counselors, aldermen, construction managers, sanitation supervisors, and of course, the city police. Police corruption in Chicago was rampant. Only a handful of policemen could be trusted to uphold the law. In one South Side ward, Al Capone's allies effectively bought off the entire police force.
In this particular district has been documented. Virtually every police officer assigned to that district, from the commander on down to the street sergeants, were all on the so-called pad. And this was at a time when the salaries of police officers were measured in perhaps $1,000 or $2,000 a year, and some of these payoffs were amounting to as much as $7,500 a week for patrol officers.
In the race to control Chicago, the mob had the money to control the law. At the track and other sporting events, meanwhile, Al Capone and other mob bosses received star treatments.
Look who's here, Al Capone himself. There he is in the center with his hat off. Have a good time, Al. Your next race will be to the Hooskow.
The time, the 1920s. The place, urban America. It was a time of turbulent social change, a time of high living and high spending. In the big cities, dandies and flappers, awash with cash, lived the high life. Illicit liquor fueled gambling, nightclubs, and dancing. In the bootlegger's wake, the entertainment industry flourished. Al Capone and fellow gangsters even became patrons of the arts. In the nightclubs and speakeasies, customers craved a new kind of music. It was fast and furious. It provided the soundtrack of pre-World War II America. It was jazz. Many jazz artists got their first break from Capone in Chicago or mobsters in New York. Bootleggers bankrolled the jazz explosion of the 1920s, boosting the early careers of Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and other luminaries. Even in an age of intense racism and segregation, gangsters like Al Capone actively fostered and promoted African American talent. The 1920s was the first decade of female emancipation, and women were not slow in making their mark on the gangster scene. The gangsters had their families, but they also had their girlfriends, also called a moll. Many women must have found the wealth and power of the mobster attractive, but danger was another allure, which gangsters knew and knew how to use. Scarface did more than any other film to define the classic moll.
Well, you're looking swell. I thought we were going to see something of you.
Well, there I am.
Where have you been?
Poppy is the boss's girlfriend, but when the dapper Tony Camonte makes a move on her, devotion and constancy are the last things on her mind.
Don't work too hard.
I just finish up tonight. Now I play a while.
You got your own table, Camonte.
What's that?
This is a table for two.
Well, maybe you get another table, eh, Johnny?
Hey, listen, you. What do you think you're...
In reality, though, some malls and mobsters were capable of normal relationships. These are the eyes of an infamous mob man, Capone triggerman Machine Gun Jack McGurn, who was often seen in the company of Louise Rolfe. McGurn married Rolfe on the advice of a friendly newspaperman. The reason, a wife can't testify against her husband. And the man who snapped the wedding pictures was press photographer Tony Baratti.
Oh, they were just a couple of lovebirds. They were great. I don't think she would have, married or not, I don't think she would have testified. She was a pretty tough gal.
In fact, Rolfe did appear in court, but only to swear that Jack was with her at a particular time. If lawyers and judges were fooled, the newspapers were not. They called Rolfe the blonde alibi. But their love was not destined to last. In the early 1930s, Rolfe and McGurn parted on bad terms. She returned to her career as a nightclub singer. Hollywood made much of the doomed relationship between the gangster and moll.
A rat he's born, a rat he lives, a rat he dies. James Cagney.
In The Public Enemy, notorious gangster Tom Powers, played by James Cagney, is in love with a society woman, and he knows he's out of his depth.
Yes or no? And I can never figure you out.
Now can you?
But the women were not always so classy. Even in the silent era of the 1920s, movies showed that women could be every bit as tough as their bad guys. Here in Outside the Law, actress Priscilla Dean plays Silky Moll. Molly helps her partner trap a cop and a rival gangster. Molly is no shrinking Violet. She's shrewd and she's tough. There's no question she'll shoot if she has to. And for some, characters like Silky Moll reflected the changing role of women in society at large.
The interesting metamorphosis of the gangster film has also been the inclusion or growth or evolution of women in the films. They went from being the hostesses, the girlfriends, to being actual players, to actually being gangsters themselves.
Indeed, women ran speakeasies and gave orders. Take Texas Guinan. She was a nightclub owner who famously greeted her customers with the words, "Hello, suckers." Guinan remained a power to be reckoned with throughout the bootleg years. The malls of the speakeasy should not be overlooked in any history of how gangsters changed America. But for malls and their mob boyfriends alike, the bootleg years were about to come to a sudden end. The party couldn't last forever. Before the year 1929 was out, the Roaring Twenties would end as mob-related crime would turn public opinion against organized crime. The year had begun with an outrage, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The killing of a group of mobsters shocked the public, first in Chicago, then across America, then around the world. People began calling for an end to gangland violence. The grisly crime finally awoke the sleeping giant of law enforcement. Thanks to the massacre, the science of ballistics was deployed for the first time in a murder investigation.
There's no crime that cannot be solved.
But in spite of the new technology, police investigations proved fruitless. The killers were never caught. But everyone knew who the real culprit was. The press, public, and government began ganging up on just one man, Al Capone. Veteran crime reporter John O'Brien explains.
The massacre gave rise on a number of fronts to the ultimate overthrow of Capone. It had the effect of steeling the federal government to do something. A tax case was put together against Capone and was successfully prosecuted in 1931.
Capone would soon be on his way out, but gangsters everywhere soon faced a new threat from an unexpected source. The New York Stock Exchange has nothing to do with organized crime, yet thanks to the stock market, American gangsters would soon face their greatest crisis. The 1920s had been a decade of high-rolling and high-risk trading. But in October 1929, a sudden loss of business confidence sent share values tumbling. The mass panic on trading floors was felt across America. The Wall Street crash triggered the Great Depression. Bread lines and soup kitchens became a common sight on city streets. Prohibition wasn't quite over as the bootleg years drew to a close. But the gangster legacy lived on, conjured through movies, music, and attitude. By 1930, gangsters were part of the composition of America.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
Where does jazz have its roots?
What social conditions led to the rise of organized crime in America?
We hope you've enjoyed this assignment discovery journey into the Roaring Twenties. If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.
That's a wrap for today, but tune in next time as we journey further into the Great Depression. First, we'll explore the conditions that led to the Depression. Then we'll travel through the Dust Bowl and into the West. Finally, we'll see how World War II served as a catalyst for America's economic recovery. Join us next time for America's Economy, Sorrow and Hope, here on Assignment Discovery.